Israeli Supreme Court judges served Netanyahu's government a bombshell decision. Where is this coalition heading? More troubling anti-Semitic incidents in the U.S. and the results of the most expensive House primary in history is heard well beyond New York's 16th district. We will be talking about that with one of America's leading commentators, Van Jones. It's Unholy. I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London. It's Unholy, two Jews on the news. You and I are in the early stages of what is going to be a marathon day. We're recording on Thursday afternoon, London time and Tel Aviv time. But this is
morning US time.
Morning US time, but this is the very dawn of, we are just at the foothills of what is going to be a marathon 24 hours. Because we've only just discovered that both of us, completely separately and for our respective employers, have plans to be up and working in the middle of the night because it is presidential debate time in America. And I'm going to be doing it for Politics Weekly America, the podcast I do for The Guardian, all about American politics.
Dubbed the other podcast.
The other podcast, capital O, capital P. And you are anchoring Channel 12's coverage of this massively important debate.
In the middle of the night, which is not my normal hour to anchor the news, one should say. Yes, we are totally two Jews on the news today, all through the night as well. I might drag you to a post-debate conversation after this is all over. But right now, we are recording this on Thursday, and our listeners who will listen to this on Friday are smarter than we are because they already know what happened. So this is the reality we're in.
Maybe they're smarter than we are all the time.
It could
anyway,
be. I think
even when it's not a presidential
I suspect
debate.
That's probably true.
No, it's a funny thing, these late night, middle of the night recordings that I've been doing for a while. And since the COVID era, doing them at home because you now can. And so it means there was one period in the 2020 election cycle when I was recording one and I had my, teenage son sleeping next door. And so it was the strangest kind of podcast because I was essentially on one level doing a podcast, on the other level whispering so as not to wake him up because I'd been watching Trump Biden round one, as it turns out to be. That was 2020. Now we're into round two. It's amazing how early it's come about. June is very, very early in the cycle for a presidential debate. It's normally October. But yeah, so we'll be doing that. Meanwhile, we thought we would talk a little bit about what we did on the podcast last week, because you, the audience, have responded in a really big way to the interview Yonit and I did with Rivka Ravitz, ultra-Orthodox leader and luminary, all about the Haredi exemption from military service. And, Yoni, a lot of people came back to us about it.
Yes, I mean, first of all, we really appreciate the responses. We go through all of them. And I think that the feeling after that conversation was that we should have been more confrontational. And that obviously this is the topic that tears apart the Israeli society, the fact that there are people who don't do military service. And of course, we are in the middle of a war. So not only are there a lot who do, because most of the population is conscripted, it's a mandatory service, but there are a lot of people who are, they die or they return home either, injured or in a mental different state. This has become the one thing that this whole society and, of course, political sphere is rallying around. So a lot of people thought we should argue more. But I think for us, and we should say that these things we do plan. A lot of it is spontaneous, but this we do think of seriously before every interview that we do. We thought that to try and listen to her, and by the way, in her world and within her community, she said things that are extremely brave, that should be noticed, right? I mean, the fact that she said, kind of insinuated that under a different government, probably the ultra-Orthodox would have a better deal and would have it easier. The fact that she talked about having a female member of Knesset from United Torah Judaism. These are all things that are very sort of, a brave thing to say. You only get, you and I, between us, we've been interviewing people since the age of 18. We have a few decades of interviewing people. The only way to get that kind of interesting stuff, I think, is if you make sure that you're not closing off the person you're talking to.
Yeah, absolutely right. Not sort of blocking and closing down and fighting someone, but instead listening to them. What rankled a lot with, a good number of listeners was particularly Rivka Ravitz's point that we can't risk our children coming back secular. And people wrote back saying, Sorry, we're risking our children coming back dead.
Yep.
And they, which is the greater risk? And a lot of people said, look, love Unholy, listen to you every week, but this really got them because they wanted us to say what they were thinking and to push back harder to Rivka Ravitz. And you've explained, Yonit, exactly why we weren't in that mode. We were instead in a mode where we wanted to hear that case met. And as you say, in her world, quite brave, for example, to admit, as she did, that she feels bad when she talks to, as it were, secular or non-Haredi mothers in particular who are doing what she's not doing, which is risking the lives of their children, and that she recognized there was an issue there. And so it was to tease that out that was really our objective. But very good to have heard from people listening to this, how you felt about that. And in this case, very strongly, a lot of you felt that we needed to go harder. Others, meanwhile, said very different reactions, and we're glad we did it the way we did. Anyway, you have said at the beginning that on this very matter, Yonit, there's been big news out of Israel, and it came right at the start of the week.
Indeed. Occasionally I would say that we in the journalism business TV journalism, we tend to throw around the word dramatic or historic a lot. We do it with the baritone, right? It's dramatic, it's historic. This one really fits the bill. It was extremely dramatic and historic. Israel's Supreme Court judges ordering the state to draft ultra-Orthodox men and halt the funding for the yeshivot, that's the Torah studying seminars, who don't cooperate with that conscription. So this is really dramatic. This has never happened before. The court and the attorney general ordering thousands to be conscripted into the military. By the way, funding is a very crucial thing as well as part of this issue. Now, why is this happening? We've been talking about this a lot in the podcast. The law that did temporarily exempt ultra-Orthodox from military service expired July 1st. There was a desperate need to write a new law. The prime minister did what he does best, which is to delay and to kick the can down the road. This was the court essentially saying, enough is enough. You have not managed to bring a law. We need to do this now.
So normally, I mean, this is nothing normal. It's a huge deal. But one would immediately think, well, right, that's that. I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu has to do this immediately. That's what the court have ordered. And that will be any decision he takes surely breaks up his coalition, because you cannot keep those Orthodox parties in there and comply with the order of the Supreme Court to enlist young Orthodox men in particular into the military. That's what you would think. The reason why I say and hesitate is because Netanyahu is a kind of political Houdini who is in these jams, in these fixes so many times over his career, and somehow gets out of them. And the way he usually does that is by delay. Delay is a favored technique of politicians throughout history and throughout the world, but he's a real maestro of delay, of kicking the can down the road, finding a mechanism, finding some way out of it. And something tells me he'll find a way, but maybe this time really is impossible for him.
Look, what is going to happen now is two things. One, Netanyahu is going to try to convince the ultra-Orthodox, this is just a blip. Don't worry, I'll get a law, we'll get it passed, this will be resolved. But what happened this week was that his own member of Knesset, Yuli Edelstein, chair of the very powerful Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee in the Knesset, basically spoke out against this and said, I can't pass the law as it is written now. We will need everyone to agree on these, even the opposition. Everyone understands that is impossible. And even if you don't have Yuli Edelstein, who's basically just putting a mirror in and showing you reality, there is no law that will be agreed upon by members of Likud who think that it needs to be a tougher law on conscription, and the Haredim that think they don't want to be conscripted. So there's no way that this can be resolved. I think that we've been talking about this for a long time. There is a question of when does this blow up? When is the moment when the Haredim say to themselves, the ultra-Orthodox say, whatever is happening to us now in this coalition is worse than rolling the dice, taking the chance, and going to elections. When does that happen? Importantly, we should say the spiritual leader of the ultra-Orthodox party, Shas, Rabbi Moshe Maya, said, after the decision made by the Supreme Court, we will not enlist. So that's taken it up a notch. Everyone here is prepared for this battle. Now, try and see it. I know that we were talking about Rivka Ravitz, talking to her last week. Try and see it, Jonathan, from the eyes of an ultra-Orthodox ultra-Orthodox person who, when this coalition was set up, December 2022, thought two things, right? One, there's going to be finally an official law that exempts them from military service. And remember the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox logic for the judicial reform, right? That if the Supreme Court tries to intervene and says this law is obviously not an equal law and it's problematic, we will have a judicial overhaul that will override the Supreme Court. So everything's fine. Now we are a year and a half into this coalition, and the ultra-Orthodox can't get anything done. They went through the desert for 5 years with Netanyahu. They never broke the block from him, and they got, excuse my Jewish expression, bubkis for this, right? So that a moment will come. I don't know if the moment is in 2 weeks. I don't know if the moment is in 2 months. But a moment will come when they will have to ask themselves, what are we actually still doing in this coalition?
Yeah, first of all, not quite bubkis. I mean, they've had big money channeled and funneled to their institutions.
I just wanted to hear you say bubkis. I said that for you to pick that up, honestly.
Bubkis with a London accent. But they've been getting that cash has been rolling into their coffers, again, at odds with and to the fury of plenty of Israelis when times are difficult, that they see these yeshivot, religious academies flush with cash. So they've not got nothing, but absolutely right. They haven't got the big things they wanted. This notion of rolling the dice, and remember, Rivka Ravitz said to us that they, as you mentioned, that they feel they might well get a better deal with other parties who are not even though they're traditional allies. What would that a better deal look like? Now that you've had the Supreme Court saying there's no getting around this, it's been decades of this has gone back and forth, but the law requires equality and everyone must serve. What is the mechanism that what's the deal they think could be done with other parties that simultaneously doesn't cross the Supreme Court and their demand that the law be applied equally and simultaneously keeps them out of military service? What's the fix they think they could get?
If the law is followed, if the decision of the Supreme Court and the Attorney General is followed and there is no law to be put in place instead, because the Supreme Court was saying, if you have a law, it's not a problem. The problem is there is no law to organize this. So what an ultra-Orthodox will be going through is either an order to go to conscript, go into the military. There are going to be cuts of, budget cuts. The world of subsidized childcare, which is also what they were receiving from the government and things like that. All those benefits are cut. That is very bad. So if you're asking what can be better, anything but this can be better. I think there are all kinds of compromises to be made. Remember the law that Netanyahu is trying to pass now, but it can't be passed when there is a war, when soldiers are dying, and when this is the one issue everyone is talking about. I think they might be hoping that in 6 months, when this is all behind us, if it is behind us, it would be easier to cut a deal and maybe say, okay, we're not going to enlist 3,000 and more, but we will talk about, kicking the can down the road again for 5 years instead of 10 years, instead of, things can be talked about when there is a government that is less criticized and is more popular. That is, I think, a consideration that they are making or should be making in this regard. Now, we should talk about politics in the polls because this is hitting Netanyahu very hard. You see that in the polls. There was this moment where he managed to, maybe have a better result, but you see it. It is hurting him in his own base. There are many, many people in the Likud who are serving, their children are serving. They really dislike what is going on. And that is why you're seeing more and more MKs in the Likud. I'm not saying a rebellion, but definitely a defiant and standing in front of Netanyahu and saying, we're not going to pass this bill the way it's written right now.
Yeah, and you can see a new constellation of forces beginning to emerge. You can just sort of glimpse how there could be that kind of reshaping on the right, because yes, people who are absolutely signed up for the hawkish agenda of Netanyahu, people who are prepared to overlook his own legal problems, the corruption trials and so on, but draw a line at the notion of giving a free pass and exemption to one group of Israelis when everyone else is in harm's way and has to put their, themselves or their children in harm's way. And so, the outline of a kind of new right, a non-Bibi right. We've talked about it a while. And we've actually talked to one of the people who is thought to be central in this reshaping, namely the former head of the Mossad, Yossi Cohen. He's one of the names people put together with former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, longtime fixture on the right, leader of the sort of Russian Jewish community, Avigdor Lieberman, Gideon Saar, who was another sort of breakaway from the Bibi Likud camp. If those people were put together, said one poll this week, they would, romp home as the largest single party. One poll having them even at 35 seats, which in a 120-seat parliament is a very big deal. Another poll, I think your one put it at a lower figure than that, in the mid-20s. Yeah. So the point is that, that again, people outside the country, I think, make the mistake of thinking, if Netanyahu is out, that means the pendulum swings, much as people expect it to, for example, in this country, from right to left. Not like that. The political fault line is between Bibi and non-Bibi. In a way, all the action is sort of on the right, different flavors of the right. And so if this reformulation happens, realignment, it will be a shift within the right from Camp Bibi to Camp un-Bibi with a couple of sort of star names in there.
I mean, that's exactly right. In Hebrew, it's rak Bibi or rak lo Bibi, which means only Bibi camp or the only anything but Bibi camp. But I want to talk about those three individuals just for a moment, if I may, particularly Bennett, who was prime minister, Avigdor Lieberman, who was foreign minister, defense minister, and finance minister, both very close to Netanyahu in different times of their lives, and Yossi Cohen, as you said, head of the Mossad. Now, what is going on seriously now is that there are discussions between Bennett and Lieberman of forming a party. The main thing that is the obstacle at this point would be ego, to be honest. I mean, who should go first? One of them was prime minister. The other is stronger in the polls. That's a question. I said to you, and you looked at me like I was a little bit crazy before the elections 2021, that Naftali Bennett can be the next prime minister. So I will say to you, and this is a much less risky assessment, Avigdor Lieberman can be the next prime minister of Israel. If these polls are correct, if they do actually form a party, and if he's number one. That could happen because that will channel the right-wing voters that dislike Netanyahu. And there's a big group like that, right? If you think about the fact that the coalition is now 64, and in the polls you see it at 47, that is the pool that can take, that Bennett and Lieberman can take from.
And also it could be appealing, I'm thinking, to some of those right-wing voters who think Naftali Bennett is sort of damaged goods by his time in office, and not right-wing enough, because he teamed up with Yair Lapid, he had Mansour Abbas, an Arab politician.
Well, Lieberman sat in that coalition as well, right?
He did, but he wasn't the face of it in quite the way that Naftali Bennett is. And so there's, he is relatively, compared to Naftali Bennett, less tainted. And so there will be, a type of right-wing voter who thinks, look, we've tried the others, let's try this new guy, relatively speaking.
Completely. Yossi Cohen is a little bit of a different deal because he didn't sit in that change government that people would say, oh, they betrayed Netanyahu. Yossi Cohen kind of didn't. So he might run independently. There are questions. He's really the person that can pull away votes from the hardcore Netanyahu audience. There are questions, well, if he does run and if he does run independently, will he not eventually, join the Netanyahu bloc? There's a lot of questions here. It's a very open, place that we are in. We should say two things about Bennett. First, that he comes first in the compatibility questions. Who is most compatible to be prime minister? Remember, a few weeks ago, you were shocked that Netanyahu suddenly won Benny Gantz. So he doesn't win him anymore. Benny Gantz does go beyond him, but the one who gets the most percentage points is Naftali Bennett. He also kind of insinuated a comeback this week. He said, I remind you that it's 3 years since we set up the change coalition and we can make that change again. So that kind of sounded a little bit like the next sentence is, my name is Naftali Bennett and I approve this message. So that is all happening now. Whatever happens, look, we talked a lot about the fact that the Knesset is out of session July 28th. It will actually be a little bit before that because Netanyahu goes to Congress July 22nd. He doesn't think anyone will try and topple him in those critical days, even if the government doesn't fall now. It is still a very risky business. Still, the problem exists of the ultra-Orthodox in October. October can already be a point in which Itamar Ben-Gvir starts thinking maybe he should gain more outside the coalition than inside. This is unraveling. I cannot say how fast it's unraveling, but it's definitely, the signs are there. That is definite.
Still, the man in the chair, while we talk about his potential successors, still there, Israel's longest-serving Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, he made some news because he broke a habit of the last year by giving an interview in the Hebrew language.
Yes, pretty amazing, isn't it? After almost 9 months in which the Prime Minister of Israel, or rather the citizens of Israel, had to rely on translation from English to Hebrew to know where the Prime Minister stands on many of the important issues of the day, Netanyahu, indeed, breaking with tradition and giving an interview in Hebrew to Channel 14, which has long been considered his mouthpiece. This is a comfortable, convenient sort of home zone for him. I think it is interesting to say that he did indeed say a few things that are important. And as the war continues, he said that he supports a partial hostage deal. And he said, which will release some of the hostages, but he is not going to stop the war. Now, that created a bit of blowback because Netanyahu, under the Biden framework of the hostage deal, is supposed to, at some point, the second stage, to be accurate, say the war is over. This is why this whole thing is still being delayed. Netanyahu tried to fix that the day after and said he does support the Biden framework. But, that is something that is very important to note as we are in the, day 264 of this war, almost 9 months.
Yeah, I mean, one Israeli source was said afterwards, this is the statement that Netanyahu had given in that interview was actual sabotage. It's difficult to see how we can reach a deal in the near future. It's game over for a deal. He's giving up on releasing the abducted soldiers and on the chance to bring home the women, female soldiers, the elderly. Fury at saying this because, of course, by saying, oh yeah, we're only interested in a partial deal, he appears to vindicate exactly what Hamas have been apparently telling the mediators, which is, we're not going to do this deal whereby we give up the bargaining chips we have, these hostages, only for then Netanyahu to go back to the war that he wants to prosecute, by saying we're obligated to continue the fighting after a pause. So, look, fine to actually plan that, but don't say it on television, because if you do that, you're not going to get those hostages out. That was the argument that was made by people, as it were, on his own side, people, I think, close to the negotiations, feeling like they're tearing their hair out because he's constantly undermining what they're doing. Just a point on the platform chosen for the interview, you rightly said it was on Channel 14, which is his kind of happy place because it's, Channel BB, all BB all the time. Channel 14 has been a bit of an outlier. Some fears that it may not be such an outlier for so long because Channel 13 has now got an incoming new CEO in the form of Yulia Shamalov-Berkovich, who is a very close ally of, you've guessed it, Benjamin Netanyahu. So some fears about the independence of Channel 13, but for now, Channel 14 is the pro-Bibi channel. And, Netanyahu has refused to be interviewed by journalists like you on other channels, proper independent journalists, and instead has just gone to what is essentially the Fox News of Israel. So that's where he chose to make these remarks, which appear to have set back yet further any hopes there were of some kind of hostage deal.
You mentioned Channel 13 and their woes, we should say, colleagues and serious journalists, and the question of Yulia Shamalov-Berkovich, who, by the way, also there are many, we have to say that many women's advocacy groups in Israel are against this because of things that she said, doubting sexual harassment, attacking single mothers and calling feminists jihadists, all kinds of things, which are problematic in itself. But the fact that this is yet another person who is considered Netanyahu's ally and will be, or supposed to be, the backbone of this network, which has such a very impressive news division, a news company, I think is a worrying thing. And it is part of a trend to try to have more politicians involved in broadcast television in Israel and in other media outlets, which I think is, even in the shadow of the war, when we're concerned about many other things, I think this is something that we should notice.
The one thing you can say about the war since October the 7th is it has not been confined to Israel and Gaza. It has reverberated all around the world, and especially in this election year in the United States. It came straight to New York City this week with a primary contest on the Democratic side for a congressional race. The incumbent New York Congressman Jamal Bowman lost that primary to George Latimer. And it became a kind of proxy for the whole argument that has riven the Democratic Party over Gaza, because AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, spent a colossal sum of money, nearly $15 million, essentially against Bowman, who they regarded as being on the wrong side of the issue. It's part of a wider picture. AIPAC have been spending very big this election cycle and been seen as a very big blow to the progressive camp in the Democratic Party. Meanwhile, in Los Angeles, really ugly scenes outside the Adass Yisrael synagogue in the very Jewish neighborhood of LA. Pico Robertson, people who've been to LA will know that neighborhood. Protesters scuffling. Some people call it protest, some people call it a pogrom. Really, really ugly scenes. Jewish people saying this is an anti-Semitic act to protest against Jews in a synagogue. The pro-Palestinian demonstrators saying they weren't there because it was a synagogue, but rather because it was hosting a kind of real estate fair selling properties in Israel and the West Bank. Those are the two arguments, but it's meant that in a very intense way, everything that's been raging since October 7th was on the streets of America's two biggest cities, New York and LA, this week.
Yeah, I think there should be a question about why do you demonstrate in front of a synagogue. But let me put that aside for a minute to talk about the Jamal Bowman story. Look, if you're going to be someone who goes after Israel so hard and denies rapes happened on October 7th in a constituency that is so heavily Jewish, that is an issue. I will just say, generally speaking, if you are a public official who says that about what happened on October 7th in general, I think that is a problem. I think what the takeaway from this story, the way I look at it, two things I would mention. One, Jews are going to get blamed whatever they do, right? If they would not do anything against him, then they were weak. If they would try and, organize themselves against this candidate, then you have all of that, those claims, those tropes about Jewish money and, colluding and all of that. I kind of wish that the sequel to David Baddiel's brilliant Jews Don't Count would be Jews Can't Win. So I just think that if we're going to be blamed anyway, at least let's be organized and efficient. That's one thing. The other thing is that I think that look, this has to be a movement. The pushback, the war against anti-Semitism has to be a movement. And any movement in the world needs the help of the outsider. Okay? It was John Stuart Mill as an MP who needed to petition for women's suffrage. They couldn't do it by themselves in that regard. Women needed men to help them with that movement. And the African-American community and the civil rights movement needed white Americans to help them out. And Jews now need the non-Jews to be their allies and to help them. Because otherwise, I don't see how this whole thing will succeed. I think that our guest this week fits into that category.
Van Jones is a lawyer, civil rights activist, former official in the Obama administration, where he was the point man on green jobs, and a regular commentator on CNN, where his contributions have a habit of going viral. He is also a leading voice for Black America and a longtime observer of and player in the Democratic Party. Van Jones, welcome to Unholy.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I mentioned how things of yours often do go viral. The last one to do that was your take on what happened in Los Angeles, this protest that degenerated into some pretty ugly scenes outside the Adass Torah synagogue. You said it was not a protest, but a pogrom. And you said, as if addressing protesters, you're not trying to start a conversation, you're trying to start a fight. I'm interested to know what reaction on the left, among your fellow Democrats, or others, progressives, what reaction you got for that view?
Well, I don't really know. I'm not on social media. I don't care. I got a lot of positive feedback from Jewish folks all around the world, the ones who could get my email or text messages and stuff like that. So I know that it struck a chord. And I got a couple of grumpy text messages from a few former friends. But, at a certain point, you just have to call balls and strikes here. It's completely a red line to rush up into a house of worship of any kind. Even a military campaign, people are very reluctant to strike a mosque or to strike a church or to strike a synagogue because it's just not done. And so the fact that there was something happening at the synagogue that the protesters didn't like, is no excuse for the kind of behavior. Plus, I'm living in Los Angeles. I'm raising my kids in Los Angeles, and I didn't want to normalize the idea that you could do stuff like this. You got two cities in the United States where a lot of Jewish people live: Los Angeles and New York. If it's open season on synagogues in those cities, there's no safe place for Jews in America. And I just thought it was ridiculous. I was shocked that people responded the way they did in terms of the amount of appreciation. If there was some lack of appreciation on social media, I don't know, and I don't care.
Well, just on that quick point that you made, that there was something else going on there and you don't care. This is a reference to the fact that there was a sort of real estate fair where people were marketing properties in Israel, and it said in the West Bank. And so the organizer said, that's why we were there, not because it was a house of worship, because that real estate fair was going on. You're saying that makes no difference to you?
I'm sure there's a lot of bad stuff happening in mosques. There might be some bad thing happening in a mosque. I haven't seen anybody run up in a mosque. There may be some bad stuff happening in some Christian churches. You don't do that. You don't block entrances. You don't punch people in the head. When the cops come and ask you to leave, you don't then go wandering all through a Jewish neighborhood, punching people, and that's a pogrom. There's always going to be a pretext to attack a vulnerable minority group like the Jewish community. There's always a pretext, but the question is how you conduct that gives some sense as to what your intentions are. If you're really concerned about real estate transactions on the other side of the world, which maybe you could be or should be, then you show up and you make that point, and then you go home. You do not block human beings from entering a house of worship anywhere in the world without knowing you're going to draw a tremendous response from that community. That tremendous response. Can you imagine if somebody did that to a mosque? The Muslim world worldwide would react. And so at that point, you're not really going after a policy, you're going after a people. And there's no excuse, there's no pretext that would allow, maybe stand across the street, but you don't go and block that entrance and then start punching people. You just don't do it. You just don't do it.
You spoke at the March for Israel in D.C. Very strong words. You said there's been an explosion of violence against the Jewish people. You said the Jewish community stood with the civil rights movement, walking arm in arm. I can't be silent when Jews are under attack. How worried are you of this wave of anti-Semitism in the United States that we're seeing?
Well, I'm worried about it, but I'm worried about it for three reasons. One is I'm obviously concerned about people who are Jewish not feeling safe. It's been 2,000 years getting chased out of every country, having to sleep with your bags packed because you never knew when things were going to turn. And it didn't matter if you had white skin. It didn't matter if you were male. It didn't matter if you had money. Those things are not protective of Jewish people. I think on the left, we have this idea that if you're white, if you're male, if you have money, then you're privileged, and therefore you're kind of almost in a second-class position when it comes to moral concern. That's a problem in and of itself. But none of those things have been protective of Jewish people. And so you got to worry about that, and you got to speak out about that. But I also worry that as the left gets minimally less sensitive to the concerns of anti-Semitism, it's hard to know, people are actually becoming more and more anti-Jewish. They certainly are being less sensitive to the concerns about being anti-Jewish. That breaks alliances that are important in the United States. It threatens the Black-Jewish alliance. It threatens the alliance between the Jewish community and the Democratic Party. It puts at risk the Progressive Coalition. That's a concern. And there's a bigger concern that, going after Jewish people is always a precursor to a bunch of other stuff. First they came for the Jews, and then, everything else. And I am concerned that there are some geopolitical adversaries for the United States and for the West that are deliberately whipping up concern in ways that they're taking legitimate concerns. The Palestinian cause is a righteous cause for more human rights, more dignity, more sovereignty for Palestinian people. That's a righteous cause. Nelson Mandela embraced that cause, but Nelson Mandela didn't embrace groups like Hamas. And that's where things get off the rails. And I'm concerned that there are some geopolitical actors and adversaries that want to whip this up so they can do bad things to democracy and bad things to the West in general. And so it's a very, very concerning thing. And none of this takes away from the need to defend Palestinian dignity and sovereignty and human rights. But you have to do those things in a way that you don't give aid and comfort to the enemies of democracy and to actual haters and bigots. And that is a fine line to walk. And it's a line that I think it's incumbent upon progressives to walk. And when you go completely over the line and you jump the shark and you're now running up into synagogues, somebody's got to blow the whistle.
Mm-hmm.
And just to clarify, when you mention geopolitical actors who might be behind this, I'm thinking Iran. Do you have somebody else in mind?
Well, look, I think Iran, Russia, China, and North Korea are the big four, I think, geopolitical adversaries against the West, against Western democracy, which is not to say that Western democracies are perfect. Far from it. Flawed, troubled, often dysfunctional democracies that we have, often home to all kinds of bigotries and biases and historical tragedies and atrocities, but democracies nonetheless. And I think you have a block of democracies that are improvable. We're trying to improve them over the past couple hundred years against these kind of imperfect democracies, against four perfect totalitarian states, four perfect authoritarian regimes: China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran.
So the thing I wanted to follow up on when you talked about the risk, what you're seeing now could pose to you mentioned the Black-Jewish relationship. We'll hopefully we'll come on to that. But just in terms of the democratic, capital D, alliance of different groups, how concerned are you about the impact the war in Gaza is having on those elements of that coalition, meaning Jewish support for the Democrats, Arab American support for Democrats, young people? There seems to be a lot of fracturing that's being caught into the Democratic coalition that's being caused by this war. Just talk us through how you see that playing out, because there's been some new evidence that's come, polling evidence that suggests it's sort of cracking in all kinds of places.
Well, it is. I mean, because there are two fundamental values that are at odds now within our coalition. On the one hand, human rights for all, certainly for groups that are vulnerable. That's key for this party, and yet that cuts in different ways on this question. So, what's happening to Palestinians, especially unarmed Palestinians who are not a part of any terror organization, who are just literally trying to find food and water? It's a heartbreak for the whole world, and Democrats don't want to see that type of suffering, and so that brings forward a certain amount of passion, as it should. From the Democratic Party and from the base in particular, and the young people even more so, because they're seeing these images on their cell phones in ways that they've never seen before. And so that's important, and that has to be protected and respected, that humanitarian outcry from the party. At the same time, there's another set of values, which is to protect the state of Israel, to protect the Jewish community from hateful terrorist attacks. And you don't want to leave the state of Israel, you don't want to leave Jewish people open to being attacked, raped, butchered, slaughtered, all the things that Hamas inflicted upon Israel, and all the rockets that were being flown out of Gaza into Israel the whole time. And so that's a challenge. And so these are two good protective values that both live in our party, that are now being stimulated in ways that become oppositional. And so it takes sober leadership to respect both sides, to protect both sides, and to try to find a way forward. And when you have TikTok and China, trying to make sure that they can't have a nuanced conversation, that poses a real threat to the coalition. And also, unfortunately, it leaves Israelis and Jewish people still vulnerable, and it leaves Palestinians still vulnerable. And so I think that's a part of the frustration.
We've been hearing, especially here in Israel, a lot of talk of the vote in Michigan and the Democratic Party being very worried about that. Is there such a thing as a Jewish vote? Because we have been hearing these voices of, the Jewish community saying they're concerned that there isn't enough engagement, that there isn't enough, tough stance against antisemitism vis-a-vis everything we've just been talking about. Is there a concern within the Democratic Party about Jews actually not voting Democrat, which is the overall majority do vote Democrat, but is there a kind of concern that this time it might go differently?
Well, I think it will go differently. I do think that there are, the African American community votes 80 to 90% for Democrats, and then the Jewish community votes about 70 to 80%. So blacks and Jews are the two big pillars for the party. Now, of course, the black community is, I think we're 45 million. I think the Jewish community is a lot smaller than that. But the Jewish community plays an outside role in terms of the activist leadership, in terms of people who are engaged, people who are donors. And so the Jewish community is an important part of the Democratic Party coalition. And I think that there are Jewish people who feel that they're now being forced to pick between anti-Jewish bigotry in the Republican Party, which is showing up as white nationalism, which is showing up as, Jews will not replace us. And then what they're concerned about is some anti-Jewish bigotry in the Democratic Party, which is showing up in some of these protests, from the river to the sea. So you have these two alarming slogans representing two different elements in these different parties. And so there is real danger, and there is real, I think, disaffection and disappointment and dismay from progressive Jews who feel that they've been there for everybody else in our fights and struggles and don't feel as supported. And so that's going to be a problem. You could wind up with both Jews and Muslims abandoning the Democratic Party at the same time, which would only help our political opponents.
The problem of this issue and how it's bearing down on the Democratic Party became very clear this week with this primary result in a congressional district in New York, the defeat of Jamal Bowman, who had been, trenchant on the subject of Gaza. AIPAC put a whole big effort into unseating him, and it succeeded. And he was replaced by more moderate George Latimer. How do you read that election and what the impact it will be?
Well, it's mixed, because on the one hand, you have to represent your district. But more, before you talk about AIPAC or anything else, Jamal was representing a very big Jewish community that did not feel represented by his position. And that doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So before you get into AIPAC and everything else, he probably wasn't going to be able to be reelected because he was taking such a strong position in opposition to Israel. And he had a Jewish community that did not feel that represented them. So that's just democracy, and you probably don't get to keep that seat. AIPAC coming in the way that it did, with the most money ever spent, is a good thing, in that it sent the message that there's a price to be paid for being as indelicate and as lacking in at least nuance as Jamal was coming across. But there's also a danger of a kind of a backlash there, because you can win a battle and lose the war if you start making martyrs out of people who probably were going to lose anyway. And so then it becomes an opportunity to say, well, look at AIPAC, meaning look at the Jews. They're being so heavy-handed. They're using their power, and some of that plays into some very negative stereotypes and stuff like that. So I think that the real problem here is not a Jamal. The real problem here is that you have a whole section of American society that is just kind of broken off from the iceberg in terms of not having warm feelings toward Israel, being very concerned about Bibi Netanyahu, being very concerned about the longstanding treatment and mistreatment of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza. And they are no longer deterred from expressing that. And that's a long-term problem, because the young people really feel that way. And in 20 years, those young people are going to be helping to run this country. If they feel that the only reason to support Israel is just out of fear, that's not going to be a stable basis going forward. As the Muslim community in the United States gets bigger, as people of color in general become more popular, become a bigger part of America. So there's a bigger problem here. And if it's all sticks and no carrots, and it's all accusation and no information and education and engagement, I think it's a long-term danger. So Jamal probably was going to lose that seat anyway. Certainly should have, if he doesn't, is represented. The people he's representing don't feel represented. But this is careful. You don't want to create martyrs unnecessarily. And there's always that danger.
I'm picking up on what you said because as an Israeli, it's very worrying for us because we see Joe Biden, right? And he always says, I don't need to be Jewish to be Zionist. But he might be, I'm not saying the last living Zionist in the Democratic Party, of course not. But as you say, the next generation is different. What do Israelis need to figure out to do to change that trajectory?
Well, look, I think that, frankly, Hakeem Jeffries is probably going to be Speaker of the House next year, Democrat, African-American from New York, very strong supporter of the Jewish community, very strong supporter of Israel, also very strong supporter of the Muslim community, also someone who's concerned about what's happening to Palestinians. There is a big chunk of people in the middle of our party that recognize that when we are a diverse party, we have to have broad shoulders, big hearts, and open hands. I think Hakeem Jeffries is a great example. He's a young guy as well of a potential future for this party. But I just think that Israel has been so consumed in its own internal stuff, tough neighborhood, tough politics, startup nation doing all its own thing. And I think it hasn't really been that engaged in some of the diplomacy, the kind of people-to-people diplomacy that might have served it. Which is not to say that there aren't elected officials that go to Israel. I mean, that you have all that. And, there is an effort. But I think the imagination, the global imagination about what Israel is and what it can be hasn't been well attended to. Tel Aviv is probably one of the coolest cities in the world.
Agreed.
Tel Aviv should, if you're gay, if you're entrepreneurial, if you're weird, you'd be more at home in Tel Aviv than probably 95% of places in the world. I don't think people know that. I think, if you're a woman in the region, the respect for women's rights that exist in Israel are singular. I don't think a lot of women of color, particularly in the United States, are made aware that Israel is a bastion for women's rights in that region. If you care about people of color, I don't think most people know that that 20% of people in Israel are Arab, and of the remaining 80%, half of those would be called people of color in the United States from places like Tunisia. The Jewish people there, half of them are people of color from Tunisia and Ethiopia and Egypt and all around the region, running for their lives out of very hostile places, finding a home and an oasis in Israel, singular in the world for them. I don't think a lot of people know that there's 1 billion Chinese people, God bless them. There's 1 billion Indians, God bless them. There's 1 billion Africans, God bless us. And only 15 million Jewish people left in the whole world, half of whom live in Israel, half of whom are people of color. I don't think people know that. And so then when you start, trying to have the story and talk about what's going on, it seems like Israel is as big as China. It seems as strong and powerful as a military as the United States. And it's like it's just running over a bunch of poor brown people. And why should anyone support that? It's a very good question. And so there has to be, I think, the other side of the story. Listen, this was 3 or 4 years ago. I'd be trying to explain the Palestinian side of the story because that story wasn't being told. Now it's being told, I think, in ways that are unbalanced and in some ways unfair. So, but this conversation about the need for dignity and sovereignty for both people, the need for Palestinians, Israelis, and others to be respected and understood and embraced, I think is important. And I just don't think it's been handled very well. And I'm going to tell you right now, there's a lot of stuff that's happening in the United States where I don't think that the response yet. I don't think that the Jewish community in the United States has gotten out of its trauma response. And so right now it's still really traumatized. And, sometimes when you're traumatized, you don't make your best arguments. And so there's going to be a process here. And all this is happening while really, truly horrific things are happening to Palestinian people. And there's real concern. And I don't think it's a bad thing that people are looking at what's happening to the Palestinian people with alarm and with compassion. I don't think that's a bad thing at all. Everything just has to be held in some kind of a balance.
I'm just wondering if what separates you from other Democrats, other progressives, and maybe even actually, there's a difference here between you and a lot of Black Americans, is the way you see Jews. And it sounds like in everything you've said to us, you see Jews as another minority, another invulnerable minority, just like you.
Yes.
Whereas the sense I get from a lot of progressives is they don't see Jews on that side of the line. They see Jews, if the world is divided into oppressed and oppressor, they think Jews are in the oppressor camp, and they think they're in the white camp. First of all, tell me if you think that's right, but if it is, how do you change that so that more people see this, dynamic and this relationship, which goes back decades, the way you do?
Well, I do think that the Jewish community had this kind of 50-year holiday from history after 2,000 years of being, mistreated in ways that are hard to describe. The African American experience, the Black experience, the African experience is a horror of world historic proportions. And I think people know that. We talk about slavery. You talk about the colonial. You talk about Belgian, the Belgians killing 6 million people in Congo, the French killing 1 million Algerians. That horror in terms of what happened to Black folks, to African folks, I think is well understood. I think that with the Jewish community, it just seems like for most people, well, the Holocaust happened. It was really bad. It was kind of a one-off. And then ever since then, everything's been fine. The Jewish people have been making a lot of money. They got their own country, and what's the problem? And I think that not understanding that you have a 2,000-year history where the Jews got blamed for everything all the time. And to the point that you could put 6 million Jewish people in ovens and the world kind of shrugs. And that's in the living memory of folks' grandparents today. That's just not something that most people walk around with foremost in their minds. And I think that most people don't know. I think most Jewish people know that their Black friends are Black. Most Black people don't know that their Jewish friends are Jewish. We just think we have a bunch of cool white friends. And we don't realize, look, if your cool white friend's name is Rachel, if your cool white friend's name is Jared, your cool white friend is probably Jewish. We don't even track for that. So when we think about the Jewish community sending their kids to great schools, and then those kids going to be public defenders in Black communities, going to be teachers for Teach for America, becoming dentists and stuff, helping to run not-for-profits, being a part of the philanthropic world in really big ways, supporting Black colleges philanthropically, Black scholarships. That's not something that is seen as the Jewish community is doing that in the Black community. That's seen as there are some cool white liberals that are doing that, but it's not assigned to the Jewish community. And so both the pain of the Jewish community seems kind of distant and maybe far away, and then the promise and the partnership of the Jewish community, it just doesn't register. And so that's why I think Jewish people have been just bewildered, and we've been bewildered. Black people are like, what are you guys talking about? The only time we hear about Jewish people is when they have a lot of money, they have their own country, they're doing well. We don't hear Jewish people having any problems because our algorithms don't show us synagogues with swastikas. Our algorithms don't show us Jewish kids getting beat up. Our algorithms show us Gaza babies, Gaza babies, Gaza babies. That's all we're shown. And those scenes are horrible. And they need to come to an end as quickly as possible. And what we see and what we've seen since at least 9/11 is the Muslim community being mistreated, the Muslim community living in fear, the Muslim community being blamed. And so it's a big switch that's required to be more inclusive. But, my godmother's Jewish. Dottie Zellner, who was one of the freedom riders in the 60s, one of the more famous ones, that's my godmother. We actually don't see the conflict overseas the same way, ironically. I do see it differently. But from my point of view, 2,000 years of getting kicked around, a 50-year holiday from history. You've never been, money has never protected Jewish people. White skin has never protected Jewish people. Being a male has never protected Jewish people. None of these factors that are so important to us as people of color struggling with poverty, they're so important to us They have not been protected for Jewish people. And it looks like history has returned, and we have to take that seriously.
Because it is a tragedy. I mean, I go back to what you said, right, that the Jewish community stood with the civil rights movement, which is, of course, true. Those communities walk together, the African-American community, the Jewish community, and it seems like such a tragedy that it isn't at all like that these days. It doesn't seem to be like that.
Well, and also these things can be overstated in that, there's some hard truths. Even in those glory days, those tough days of civil rights, the vast majority of Jewish people did not participate in the civil rights movement. That's just a fact. Also, the vast majority of Black people didn't participate either, because participating in the civil rights movement would get you killed. It would get you beat up. It would get you put in jail. So it was the Black Jewish Alliance was always a lot smaller than we remember. There was never a time all the Blacks and all the Jews. No, you always had some Black people didn't like Jewish people. You always had some Jewish people didn't like Black people. We all got some terrible uncles and some crazy cousins. But what you had, though, was that the best of the Black community and the best of the Jewish community stood together. The Black people who most believed in our cultural DNA of justice for all, and the Jewish people who most believed in the cultural DNA of repairing the world. The people who believed in that the most, for small numbers, got together and changed the world. And then we all get a chance to bask in the glory of that. But the reality is most people didn't. It was too scary and too dangerous. Most people didn't take part. But we hold on to that memory of the best of us holding on to each other. And the danger we have now is that the best of us may not hold on to each other. The best of us may not trust each other. The best of us may not know each other. And that's not just bad for Black people. It's not just bad for Jewish people. That's bad for everybody, because everybody reaped the benefit of that partnership. That Black-Jewish partnership, small though it was, changed the world. Those marches, those lawsuits, that courage, basically, we co-authored what we now call American democracy. It didn't exist. 1909, when a Black-Jewish alliance was created, that Black-Jewish alliance was called the NAACP. People don't understand. Jewish people were not considered white. They were considered colored. So the NAACP was a Black-Jewish alliance. The next year, 1910, you had another Black-Jewish alliance, which we now call the Urban League. So the two longest, strongest, proudest civil rights groups in the world were actually started off as Black-Jewish alliances. Nobody knows that. And so you have this long history. But what I don't think is good is for Jewish people who in their own personal life have done very little or nothing, except for maybe they march for 10 minutes for Black Lives Matter and put up something on their Instagram, to then tell that you should do this. We've done all this for you. Well, if you haven't personally done much, you might want to back off of that, because you might be talking to somebody who's having a much worse decade than you. You might be having a bad year, but you're talking to a Black person who's had a bad couple of decades. And so I caution that whole, we were for you, we were for you, we're for you. First of all, not that many of you were for us, and you probably aren't. And that's not a good way to start a conversation. So we gotta keep this stuff in balance.
You went viral in 2016. You talked after Trump was elected. You said, I teach my children to prepare and not to be bullies. And you talked about how this was a white lash. We're talking just before the debate. We don't know how the debate ends, but this might very well happen again. Trump might be president again.
It looked like it. I mean, that's what the polling data would suggest that right now. So yeah, listen, this is not a left-wing period. It's not a right-wing period. It is a turbulent and volatile period. That's what we're living through. We might have a change election every 4 years for the next 20 years. But where does the hope come from? The hope comes from there are cultural and spiritual resources in the Black community. And there are cultural and spiritual resources in the Jewish community that have overcome way worse than even this. Way worse than even this. And when you put those resources together, and then you reach out and you include the cultural and spiritual resources in the Muslim community and in the Buddhist community, there are cultural and spiritual resources. There are wisdom traditions in all of our peoples. And that's where we have to turn. And it's time to turn to each other and not on each other. The big problem that we have right now is that all the incentives and the algorithms and how you get attention are for division. Getting dumber and meaner and then blaming somebody else. We have an awful lot of data now, very little wisdom. That's the modern dilemma. so much data, so little wisdom. And that's why I refuse to let go of the hands of my Jewish sisters and brothers. I know what they've been through. I know what they're going through. And I know the strength and the wisdom of those traditions is a resource for humanity. I can say the same thing about the best of the Muslim faith and my own Christian faith. And that's where the hope comes from. You may not like the outcome of the next couple of elections, or you might like it one year and not like it the next year. That's going to be turbulent and rocky. There's a deeper well that we have to draw from, and we have to draw from that together.
Van Jones, much wisdom from you. Thanks so much for talking to us for Unholy.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much.
Well, Van Jones said that the world has too much data and not enough wisdom. I think the opposite was true in that conversation. Just a lot of wisdom from him, and just from a perspective that, you know, we don't hear often enough. I mean, we've talked so often over the last year or two about the growing rift between, you know, progressive America, Black America, and the Jewish community. And here was somebody saying, not nostalgically, by the way, but quite hard-headedly and realistically, that, you know, don't romanticize what it was, but equally don't lose sight of what it is and what it can be. And as for that, you know, little riff he did about speaking to fellow Black Americans saying, if you've got a cool friend called Rachel or a cool white friend called Jared, chances are they're Jewish. I mean, you just got a feeling that's somebody who knows the community he's, you know, rooted in, and knows that there is in some places some blind spots, just as there is in the Jewish community. And he was speaking to that. So I found that very heartening and quite sort of encouraging.
Incredibly and deep and moving. And, you know, it's like he sees Jews the way Jews want to be seen, I think. And when he talks about even the civil rights movement and how Jews were involved with it, and as you say, he doesn't romanticize it. He says it's the best part of the Jewish community and the best part of the African-American community that walk together. He said that part can still do that. That best part that now maybe aren't holding on to each other can still do that. I mean, he was basically making or creating this bridge between the two communities today. And I'm so glad that we heard his voice on Unholy.
To our awards then, and a bumper crop, at least in the chutzpah category. I think a very worthy winner would be Code Pink, the activist group, who decided they would be doing their bit for the people of Gaza if they were to protest outside the home of a journalist, an American journalist, thousands of miles away from the conflict, namely CNN's Jake Tapper, who has been a guest of ours on Unholy. Unfortunately for Code Pink, Jake Tapper was not, it seems, at home when they decided to protest there, and instead his children were there. And so Code Pink, undeterred, decided that the children were fair game and chanted, "Your dad's a war criminal," to these kids. And I think that is worthy, at the very least, of a chutzpah award.
Yeah, I mean, kids are off limits, period. Whatever you think and whatever your views are. And I think what was really nice was that his children not only waved to the protesters, they also played the Star-Spangled Banner for them. So that was, I think, their way, and a pretty nice way to deal with what was happening in front of their house.
Yeah, and the video went around.
Very cool kids.
Cool kids. I think the video went around, and I'm not sure it did Code Pink and their cause any favours. Meanwhile, I did say it was a crowded field in the chutzpah category. Competition comes for Jake Tapper from Nigel Farage and his Reform Party. A lot of attention on them. They are a nationalist populist party of the right. Some polls saying that they could even one day, probably not right away, displace the Conservatives in Britain as the main party of the right. They've sort of stalled a bit in the polls, but they have a candidate in a very Jewish constituency area in Britain, Bournemouth West, a man called Ben Aston, who decided that he wanted to avail himself of the opinion that the people who are behind waves of Muslim immigration into Britain, who had, in his words, imported third world Muslims into Britain, were, can you guess, the Jews. He said Jews have been agitating to import third world Muslims into Britain, channeling sort of great replacement theory, saying that they are deliberately, quote, injecting Britain with African men. Most parties would think, well, that guy's a racist, we better kick him out. But Reform had a very different take on this. They said that they would not apologise because their candidates were not party political zombies, and instead the party was proud that their candidates think and speak like the ordinary people they are. So, Reform, Ben Aston, Nigel Farage appear to think that the normal opinion of regular Britons is that the Jews are secretly plotting to transform the makeup of this country. I think that merits a chutzpah award alongside Code Pink at the very mildest.
You had me at chutzpah award for Nigel Farage, honestly. You could have stopped there. Mensch, I will give it to the teenagers of the school in Kiryat Shmona, a very northern city in Israel. And of course, they have not been home for almost 9 months. Just think about that for a moment. Their school is called Ort Danziger, and this week they had to have their sort of, end of school ceremony, kind of the Israeli version of the prom, but they are dispersed between 100 different places in Israel. We should say again, tens of thousands of Israelis have been evacuated from their house in the north. By the way, tens of thousands in the south as well. They have not returned for the most part. And they all came together, not in Kiryat Shmona, that's too dangerous, but far from there to celebrate the end of their high school. I'm sure that is not the way that they wanted to celebrate. But the fact of, I think that we should give that Mensch Award to anyone, all of the kids and the teenagers that have been under this war, almost 9 months, either living in hotels or living in other apartments, not knowing when they will be back home and managing somehow to, have a normal life or something close to that. I think they should deserve the award this week.
I agree with that very much. And we've been paying attention to the fate of those displaced people in the north, even though they have been often overlooked in a lot of the international coverage, at least. Now, we mentioned at the top that we've had a lot of reaction to last week's episode, particularly to our interview, but we did have a fleeting reference to the Jewish goodbye, and that too brought a welcome response.
Indeed. We talked at the end of our episode about how, there's this thing about Jewish goodbyes being a little bit long at the end of dinner. You're standing at the door, and somehow it would continue for a while before everyone goes home. And so we got this lovely response on Twitter from Iram Ramzan. I hope I'm saying his name correctly. He wrote to us, "A Jewish goodbye sounds a lot like a Pakistan goodbye. I've lost count of the times I've been to someone's house with my mom, and we just stood at the door for what felt like an hour, wishing we could leave already." So if we have done a little bit of, connecting the Pakistani community and the Jewish community, I think we did something rather nice.
Yeah, I would agree. And probably more in common than either might realize. Certainly when it comes to saying goodbye. Look, we're doing it right now. We're drawing it out. We're drawing it out.
Stop saying goodbye.
Stop saying goodbye. If you've enjoyed it, rate, review, all the rest.
And we will say our thank yous to Gaia Glazer, Omer Primat, and Omri Barak. And we shall meet next week.
See, not a long goodbye, not even reply. See you next week.